Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're learning this new technology on this StreamYard, and it's a pleasure to have all of you here with us. This is, of course, Peace Week here at the Carter School at George Mason University, and this is the end of it. Actually, this is the finale, and of course, we save the best for last. As always, we've had some great programming. With us is Heather McGhee, of course, and her mom, actually, Dr. Gail Christopher. We're going to be watching a short video, a TED Talk that Heather McGhee gave, and then we're going to go into a full conversation intro of our speakers. So let's go into the TED Talk.
I am a public policy wonk. I investigate data that points to problems in the American economy. Problems like rising household debt, declining wages and benefits, shortfalls in public revenue. And I try to pinpoint solutions to make our economy more prosperous for more people. I geek out about tax policy and infrastructure investments, and I get really excited by a gracefully designed regulatory regime. These are the kinds of topics that I was talking about on a public television live call-in show in August of 2016. I was about halfway through the program when a man called in, identified as Gary from North Carolina, and he said, "I'm a white male and I'm prejudiced." He then went on to detail his prejudice, talking about black men and gangs and drugs and crime. But then he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "But I want to change, and I want to know what I can do to become a better American." Now, remember, my career is about economic policy, as translated into dollars and cents, not personal thoughts and feelings. But when I opened my mouth to respond to this man on live television, the most surprising words came out. I said, "Thank you." I thanked him for admitting his prejudice, for wanting to change, and for knowing somehow that that would make him a better American. The exchange between Gary and me went viral. It's been viewed over 8 million times and inspired waves of social media commentary and news coverage. And I think people were surprised that a black woman would show such compassion for a prejudiced white man, and they were surprised that a white man would admit his bias on national television. Not long after Gary and my viral moment, we met in person. He said that he had taken my advice. He said that my words had been like someone wiped the dust from a window and let the light in. Over the years, Gary and I have become friends. And Gary would tell you that I've taught him a lot about systemic racism in America and public policy, but I've learned a lot from Gary too. And the biggest lesson for me has been that Gary's prejudice has caused him to suffer. Fear, anxiety, isolation. And it's made me rethink many of the economic problems I've been focusing on my entire career. I wondered, is it possible that our society's racism has likewise been backfiring on the very same people set up to benefit from privilege? Driven by this question, I've spent the past few years traveling the country, researching and writing a book. My conclusion? Racism leads to bad policymaking. It's making our economy worse. And not just in ways that disadvantage people of color. It turns out it's not a zero sum. Racism is bad for white people too.
Well, very, very powerful words. I wanted to introduce our speakers now. Of course, you just heard the renowned expert on American economy, Heather McGhee. She is one of the most brilliant and influential thinkers exploring inequality today, if you haven't noticed just by hearing her on her TED Talk. Her book, The Sum of Us, has become a New York Times bestseller. It reveals a devastating true cost of racism, not just for people of color, but for everyone. Her talks offer us an actionable roadmap during one of the most critical, most troubled periods in our history that we're going through today. And with us, of course, is Dr. Gail Christopher. She's an award-winning change agent, widely recognized for designing holistic strategies for social change. She is the former senior advisor and vice president of W.K. Kellogg Foundation and past executive director of the Institute for Government Innovation at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Thank you both for being here. And of course, my co-conspirator here, Charles Chavis, Dr. Chavis of the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution here at George Mason University. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy.
So great. Let's go ahead and get started based off of the video clip. Something that I think, you raised so many questions that really are at the heart of the ways in which we're considering responding to what we witnessed, not only January the 6th, but really this past year with COVID, right? And previous conversations and dialogues that we had last year post George Floyd during June, we had Eddie go out on and we talked about these two pandemics, right? Specifically the pandemic of racism, but also of COVID-19. And when you talk about, systemic racism and the ways in which your book addresses this and provides a roadmap for dealing with this, systemic racism, in what way do you think in this current moment around your work around health policy specifically, are there ways that your framework and your ideas can really inform how we're dealing with this specific health crisis that is really the racial inequities of that crisis are being highlighted, not only because of the work of that you're doing, but also because of the current phase that we're in the Black freedom struggle as it relates to social justice?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Davis and Andy. Thank you for creating the architecture and the infrastructure for people to come together in community across the DC area. It really is such an important part of the fabric of the community. So thank you for that, Andy. I am so excited to get into this conversation with Dr. Christopher, and I am going to take when you're not the moderator, I'm going to take a guest panelist privilege and kick that question over to my mother, who is the expert in health policy, who really helped put the issue of the social determinants of health on the map, who's the executive director now of the National Collaborative for Health Equity. Dr. Christopher, I don't know if you heard the question, but it'd be great to bring you in on that.
Well, especially, thank you. And I want to echo Heather's appreciation for this moment, this opportunity to share with everyone and with all of you. I would say that we have seen the cost and the consequences of years of people suffering from the effects of chronic exposure to racism, to systemic racism, institutional racism, and perhaps most importantly, to the structure of our society that's built on a premise of a hierarchy of human value. And this wears people down physically. It wears down the immune system. It wears down the body's capacity for restoration and for health. And so when something like a pandemic, a virus, a new virus, finds its way in to attack bodies that are already carrying the burden of decades of exposure to harm, then it's no surprise that we see disproportionate impact, morbidity and mortality in communities of color. But we always saw excess morbidity and mortality. It's just more acute now in this moment of crisis. So I think the lesson, the roadmap here is that we have to eliminate racism. And we have to recreate a society that lives up to its aspirational tenets, that, we are all equal and we all deserve equal opportunity. So I just think that the pandemic has revealed the underbelly of America that many of us have been fighting for decades. And then, of course, it happened to correspond with this extreme onslaught, continuous onslaught of police brutality and violence. So I think a lot is happening at once, but it's created an opportunity for us to catapult ourselves into a new, I like the term dispensation, a new country that's based on truth and on healing, and that will be transformed.
Oh, if I could just chime in, when I was hearing you speak, and I've heard you many times, some of it inside me goes, it sort of makes me mad that you have to feel like it's something wrong, like it affects you personally in order for you to do something about it. You know what I mean? Like racism should be wrong, should be morally wrong. And that should be enough for somebody to say, you know what, this is wrong, we got to change. But you turn it around and create a paradigm where the person feels, you know what, I may be racist, but maybe it's bad for me on an economic level, and therefore I'm going to change because of that reason. I'm trying to see the holistic approach to that. Is that a holistic answer? And I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
Yeah, sure, Andy. Well, I think that's really a really good question. I obviously wrestled with that. But when you identify that the big barrier is this lie of a zero-sum racial hierarchy, it's not just that I should morally want to act based on a wrong that I see happening to someone else. If I have been sold by people who profit from me having this idea, if I've been sold this idea that I am in a dog-eat-dog competition for survival with that other group, then it's not about some moral, thing that I can do out of the goodness of my heart. Our primal instinct is to survive. And if we've been taught in society that our survival depends on the extinction or the suppression or oppression of others, then you're not just asking for people to add a little more in the basket as it goes across the pew, right? You're asking for people to do something that might hurt them. And that's really the deep belief, right? Is that it would actually hurt white people for people of color to have justice. And I think that in many ways, we haven't dealt with the depth of the lie, because what else explains it, right? What else explains the way that towns across the country, including in the Washington, D.C. area, drained their public swimming pools that were segregated rather than integrating them? Mm-hmm. What else explains the bloodlust of lynching? What else explains the January 6th? What else explains the absolute fear and panic at the sight of 1,000 children who are fleeing the worst possible conditions coming to this country as people have generation after generation seeking refuge? There's something else going on there. It's not just about what charity can I provide. It's about a very deep-seated lie that people have been sold that suggests that our security, our peace, our flourishing has to come at their expense. And so that's what I really wanted to expose it for the fallacy and the idiocy that it is, and then also make the case in terms that I think can be quite galvanizing and have been quite galvanizing to millions of people who are struggling to make ends meet, who are among the 40% of adults who are paid too little to meet their basic needs, who are among the middle class, whose entire wealth is less than that which is owned by the richest 1% in the country. If you combine those forces, those who care about racial justice, and those who are open to seeing that this is what is causing that economic inequality, this racism in our politics and our policymaking is what is driving inequality for everyone, then I believe you have a permanent, majoritarian, anti-racist, pro-equality coalition that is worthy of this country, finally.
I just want to applaud. There's so much. Did you say that again? A permanent majoritarian anti-racist coalition. Okay, can we get a banner that says?
Can we get a name in on that one?
I mean, there you have it. You know, and it's thank you, Heather.
Yeah, I think for me, just to kind of piggyback off that.
Charles, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Can you get closer to the mic? Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's better. Yeah. You're a little soft.
Great. So one of the things that I think is so profound about your work again, and the work of you as well, Dr. Christopher, is like really exposing that both systemic racism or overt right versus covert racism are all bad. They're both bad policy, and they both don't benefit America, right? Because something that I think I'm really just amazingly thankful for in the ways in which you frame and you lay out your belief in America. You don't shy away from that, right? What it means to be an American and how dismantling these systems are really the most patriotic thing that we can do, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I just respect so much about your work, and it's something difficult. I think that people, marginalized people throughout this country, deal with and struggle with as they really grapple with how America has treated them systemically and otherwise. And so for me, I think now that we know that these two forms of racism are equally as damaging, right? How do we begin to structure and lay out the process for transformation, right? Because I think it's what we can all agree that what happened on January the 6th, everyone is against that. Everyone, for the most part, right? In terms of the larger mass consensus. But what is less, what people do not want to talk about is the covert racism and systemic racism that is going on in institutions, and that in many ways is leading to the various inequalities that we're trying to deal with and dismantle. I hope that's I'm kind of long-winded. I have a theological background, so I'm kind of so yeah.
Well, I'll start, and then I would love, to get into the framework for truth, racial healing, and transformation, which is one of the core recommendations in the conclusion of the Sum of Us. You're absolutely right that the majority of Republicans condemned the attacks on the Capitol, and that most Trump voters, right, likewise condemned the attacks on the Capitol. You heard, bipartisan condemnation from the people who were being hunted by a mob, right? The politicians on the Capitol. They had the temerity to agree that they did not want to be hunted by that mob, and yet the majority of the Republican caucus on the Hill in the House voted to do what the mob wanted them to do, which is decertify the election. And furthermore, I would say that it's important to recognize that the big lie of election fraud is itself something that only makes common sense, can only be believed by nearly half of Americans, can only persist today as the logic driving voter suppression bills, 250 of them across the country, including what was just signed by Governor Brian Kemp in Georgia. If the common sense is that a man who won the majority of the white vote should be president, and that people in Detroit and Atlanta, Black and brown people, were committing a crime by voting. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Right.
It doesn't make sense without the racist logic. And so that is an articulation of the way in which you have the overt, violent, white supremacist mob, and that can be condemned, and yet you still have the logic of a party and the logic of policy. The racism in our politics and our policymaking continues with the support. When President Biden said in his first press conference yesterday, when somebody asked him about Donald Trump running again, he said, I'm not sure there'll be a Republican Party in 4 years, which was very funny, Joe Biden. But what he was joking about was the corrupt rot at the heart, right? Was the fact that there is no ideology holding it together anymore. It really is just about a culture war, a zero-sum lie, trying to scare white voters into thinking that they have to arm themselves and torch the place rather than share it with their Black and brown neighbors. So that's where we are. That's the threat. That's the reactionary fringe that is holding on to as much power as it possibly can. And that's the cost, right? The cost, whether it's the trillions of dollars in economic growth that is not happening because our economic policies are so stingy and punitive to our people, because we haven't invested in our own country and in our own infrastructure since the days of the civil rights movement in a large scale, because we have, rotting pipes and leaching lead across the country and crumbling bridges and infrastructure that needs to be updated that is 50 years old, because in many ways, the majority of white Americans turned their backs on this country once it was clear that they would actually have to share it with people they'd been taught to disdain and distrust. And so the thing that made me include the truth, racial healing, and transformation story, in particular the story of the folks in Dallas, as just one really illustrative example of people doing the work at the grassroots level today, now, to heal our country, to bring together diverse stakeholders and set a new racial story of their community, and then envision a new community vision that is free of the hierarchy of human value. I wanted to include that story in the conclusion of The Sum of Us, because I wanted people to see that there is a way forward, that there is a way that's not only about, and of course, I am at my heart a policy wonk, and so I believe we need to rewrite the rules in our society to address systemic racism. We need to rewrite the rules to address economic and gender justice and indigenous rights and all of the things. And we also need to contend with the lie of the zero sum. And we need to organize in our communities and do healing work. And that's why it was so important to me to bring in Dr. Christopher's work, which I saw for myself on the ground in so many places across the country, is transforming the people who get to be involved in it. And now is the subject of 2 bills in Congress, in the Senate and the House, that could make this truth, racial healing, and transformation something that we are doing across the country and bring it to scale.
Yeah. And with that, go ahead, Dr.
Well, I can only say that after decades of trying to help people deal with the consequences of racism, all of the systemic manifestations at the individual and at the community level, I've been designing social interventions and programs, since the 1980s. And I finally just said, we need a creative solution to end racism, end the lie. And we need it to be holistic in nature. And the first thing we have to do, we know enough about neuroscience. We know enough about how the brain works. We know that the bully pulpit and all the other forms of communication, they affect what we believe. We saw that. And so we have to bring our resources together and change the story of America. That is what is so powerful, I think, about Heather's book. It is unveiling a different story of America. And it's doing it in a way that people can take it in and hear it and be affected by it emotionally, I think. And that's what happens in racial healing. People get a chance to hear and see a story of America through the eyes of their fellow human beings that they haven't seen or heard before. So narrative change is a major, major part of the work, the 5-part framework for truth, racial healing, and transformation. But then we have to get into the trenches, and we have to listen to and be with people we might otherwise not be with. That's the healing part, coming together with diverse people. And that means we all have to let go of our baggage, because whether you're Black, brown, white, immigrant, if you if you have been in America for decades, you have consumed the Kool-Aid, you have internalized some degree of racism, because that is the air we breathe in this country. And so we all have work to do to overcome our biases and learn how to have empathy and compassion and self-compassion that we extend to others. That takes work. We have to unlearn how to hate each other and learn how to love each other, quite honestly. And then finally, we ask ourselves, well, if this is a lie, and science tells us it's a lie, anthropology tells us it's a lie, the economic cost tells us it's a lie, how has it been maintained and sustained for so long? And there are three sort of pragmatic vehicles for that have been well constructed to maintain racial hierarchy. The first is by separation. Tell the lie and then don't allow you to see the truth, right? So be separate from one another, and then hold on to this fantasy that you're superior and everybody is less than you. So separation is a tool, whether it's Native American reservations or the cradle to prison pipeline, or the redlining and the residential segregation. All of these things are forms of separation to maintain racial hierarchy and oppression. The other pillar, which we see every day, is that our legal system has been designed to maintain racial hierarchy from its original days against indigenous people, against enslaved people. The legal system, not just the criminal system, but the Constitution itself originally, state constitutions. We have state constitutions that say that this state was only for white people. So racism is intertwined in our governance and legal structure. And we have to be honest about that and deal with that. And then, of course, voter suppression is the ultimate manifestation of the law being used to deny humanity and deny the franchise to people who deserve it. And then ultimately, though, and this is, again, what's so clearly illustrated in Heather's book, our economy is built on the fallacy of racial hierarchy and the permission to exploit those who are perceived to be less than. And so that's the framework in terms of, we've got to change the true narrative and tell the truth about America. And in that process, tell the truth about ourselves as a human family. It's not just looking back. We have to have a vision for a future. We have to really believe that we can undo racism. A lot of people don't believe that, but I happen to believe we can, and I've seen people do it. Then we have to work on building our new way of being together. And then we have to deal with the structural dynamics of separation, the structural dynamics of a legal system that is designed to maintain racial hierarchy, and the structural dynamics of an economy. That's the holistic approach. And we have to do this work, quite honestly, if this democracy is going to survive.
Well,
go ahead, Andy.
No, I was going to say that yes, I think Heather, you outlined pretty well, and as well as you, Dr. Christopher, the idea of how racism is bad for white people, it's bad for everyone, and therefore we should all kind of pull together. But you have to also say, I think, and you've said it, it has benefited many people, right? It has benefited people in power, and it's in their interest to maintain this hierarchy. It was established for a purpose, right? And I'm not sure the powerful are going to let go of that. That's a lot of power to have, to create that division. And if it's not race, it's going to be something else. You know what I mean? There's always going to be somebody in power who will take advantage of the divisions that are there underlying, our human experiences. How do you convince the wealthy who were not necessarily impacted by many of the things that obviously the poor white have or the working white have, but they've benefited actually from it. They've actually done better under racism.
Why are you smiling?
I'm waiting for you to take that on, Heather.
She sat back. She got popcorn. I was like,
she's ready to pounce on me. I could feel it.
Oh, no.
That is so funny. It's Friday night, y'all.
Go ahead.
Excuse me.
You
Okay.
have to spit me out. Go for it.
No, not at all. Not at all. As someone who is a business owner yourself, who has used your platform, the enterprise that you have built, for good, to promote your values in the world. I think there are plenty of people with means who are uncomfortable with the state of the world. I mean, let me be clear. And I think for the sake of communicating broadly, we do have to use shorthands. We do have to give people categories to understand what's at play here. But I don't actually believe it is in the self-interest, even of the most self-interested wealthy people, who are deluded into thinking that this is what is good for them, that it's actually good for them. It's not good for them to have a society where we are responsible for the largest share of the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing mass species loss and mass climate disaster and costing $240 billion a year in economic disasters. That's an old figure. That doesn't even take into account this year. It's not in their interest that the fossil fuel elite has used racism and racial resentment to, particularly starting in the Obama era, turn white Americans against the idea of government solutions to address climate change. It's not in their interest when they demonize the Green New Deal by race and gender baiting and demonizing Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and having the anti-government sentiment that is so baked in with the racial resentment story in this country hold us back from suiting up as we're supposed to, right? We're supposed to be Superman, this country. We're supposed to see a meteor coming to the planet and we're supposed to suit up, run into the phone booth and save the planet. That is in our story of ourselves. And yet there's a meteor coming and we're doing nothing. We are largely responsible, and yet we are letting the world burn. I don't actually think that's in the interest of most wealthy people. I don't think it's in the interest of most wealthy people to have an undereducated workforce, to have our college-going population start to decline because of student debt, which itself is another instance of the racist draining of the public pool. College used to be free back when 95+% of the people going to college were white. And the powers that be thought it was a great idea for government to pick up the tab. They thought it was a smart investment, and it was. $3 and $4 per dollar of economic benefit for every dollar invested by states in public free college. And it wasn't until the college-going population became more brown and more Black and more female that this anti-government ethos led to cuts in public investment in public colleges and a replacement at the federal level from grants to loans. And so that's not in the economic interest of the wealthy. Now, I am talking about what is honestly a very narrow, racist, power-hungry, and short-sighted part of the economic elite that has completely believed the false zero sum, that doesn't care about the McKinsey studies and the Citibank studies and the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco studies that are saying that the racial economic divides are costing us trillions. They don't care, because for them it is about maintaining a sense of hierarchy. That is not what I learned in school or in my 20 years of working at an economic think tank is how we should measure the benefits and activity and gross domestic product of our economy. But for them, it's just about the hierarchy. The numbers from McKinsey and Citigroup be damned. And so, yes, I think there is a narrow band of ultra powerful people who have convinced the majority of the Republican Party, the majority of white Americans about the zero sum lie. But if you think about it, what, 146 or 164, I'm just remembering the number off the top of my head, families gave the majority of the money in the 2016 presidential cycle.
Mm.
This elite we're talking about is actually extremely small. And yet they hold outsized power, whether it's the Sinclair family or the Murdoch family. A billionaire was able to create an entire plutocratic propaganda mechanism that is probably responsible for the majority of the zero-sum racial scapegoating lies that happen today in society.
Mm.
One man.
Mm.
And I know, Andy, I feel bad for doing this, but I want to take Heather's side and Dr. Christopher as well as my co-host. I feel bad, but as a historian, the first thing I thought about.
Wait a minute, I'm not taking sides here. Wait a minute. No.
Andy, the people are getting together.
Listen,
no, I'm not taking those sides. No.
As a historian, the first thing I thought about is when at a certain point, plantation capitalism was no longer sustainable, right? During the period of enslavement. However,
plantation capitalism,
exactly, was no longer sustainable. But the power piece, right, that you talk about, and also what withholding and maintaining the lie became more important than the money. I think that is where I see, people are going to make money off of various stages in various social movements and things like that. And so the money piece is very strategic, but there will become a point, I think, and historically we've seen this, to where it is no longer beneficial financially for to perpetuate this. But you still hold on to this. Why? Because I believe the power is so essential, and also maintaining that hierarchy, right? And those are the things I think I see that it tracks throughout history. As a historian, that's the first thing I thought about, is how you have these plantations who are going bankrupt to maintain this prestige at the end of when slavery was coming to an end, taking out loans and getting money to make sure that they were able to entertain senators and other political leaders in the South, even though that they were unable to hold things together, right? It was like all of this is taking place. Why? Not because you're making money, because that's over with. It's about power, and it's about maintaining that system. And
absolutely.
Well,
absolutely. So we're on the same page, Charles.
Well, I'm gonna play to Professor Chavis' other hat, which is his theologian hat, because I think we can get caught up in the appearance of power and not recognize the ultimate power.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this work of evolving as a species beyond these really fundamental the ultimate power. Childlike beliefs. Is this an echo? I'm hearing an echo.
Just started out of nowhere.
Okay. This is a spiritual journey. This is a journey of evolution for us. Now, if you look back, we do continue to evolve. There's a certain inevitability, unless, of course, we destroy our planet, and make it uninhabitable. But I do believe, though, that, if you look back at when we had these major transformations in society, ultimately there was a spiritual force, maybe in the form of religion or the guise of religion, but a spiritual force that was pulling people to their better and higher selves. And part of our work in this space, I believe, is to have that vision of the capacity of humanity to be better than it is. I think all of our great transformational leaders have held that belief and that vision. So, I hear all of this, but in the end, when we have ended atrocities, when we have ended World War II, when we did things that had to happen to assure that humanity survived, there was that inner drive that was a higher calling. And if you think about it, after World War II, we created many institutions that were designed not to allow wars to continue, at least not at that scale. So, I don't want to, I'm sorry about the fact that 1% of the people have all of the wealth in this country, but I'm not going to let them be the dominant force. There's a force that's higher than they are. And that's the force that I call upon and have all of my life.
Yes. Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you.
You mentioned, I think one important issue that you talked about was the subprime mortgage failure that happened with the economic crisis that we had. And you mentioned that there were $19 trillion lost in wealth, 8 million jobs. So that in itself, obviously, is something really significant to talk about. And all that is based on, really kind of has its foundation in the idea of racism is what brought about this crisis at some level. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, this is a chapter that's really near and dear to my heart that not enough people ask me about, actually, in interviews. I've noticed maybe they're a little intimidated by, finance at Wall Street and derivatives and all of that. But, everybody was touched by this crisis, in fact, across the world. So I think we all deserve to have a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what happened. And it happened to be, just by luck of the draw, the issue that I worked on for the first half of my career. Well before the term subprime was a household word, I was working at Demos on the issue of debt, doing research and advocacy, and we started to see this strange new mortgage product. And where did we see it? In the late 1990s, early 2000s, was in Black communities. Black middle-class communities of homeowners were being aggressively marketed, knock on the door, incessant ringing of the phone, these refinance loans. And what they all held in common was that they were higher interest and were laden with astronomical fees and hidden terms that made them ultimately predatory, in that they left the borrower in a worse position than before they got the loan. And, the narrative, even at the time when advocates first went to policymakers at the state level, particularly at the federal level, and said, hey, there's something going on here. We know that you guys have, in a bipartisan manner, fallen in love with the idea of deregulation, and you think that the market can fix itself and that government needs to get out of the way. We get it, but something is happening here. And instead of looking at what was going on, looking at the quality of the loans, looking at the data at who was getting the loans, they allowed this racist stereotype, which was so old and in fact came from the federal government, right? The idea that Black neighborhoods are risky investments, that Black people are poor credit risks, was the logic of the Federal Housing Authority during the New Deal that made them draw maps of the entire country and then draw circles around Black neighborhoods and say that do not lend, from a never ever substantiated idea that they would be poor credit risks. So that same logic colored the response, allowed the sort of primacy of the market to say, these loans are being given to these people, either they can handle them, or what I heard time and time again, these folks shouldn't have had houses anyway. They couldn't afford the houses anyway. But what the evidence shows is that of the whole volume of subprime loans that happened before the peak of the crisis in 2007, the majority went to people with prime credit scores, people who should have had affordable, safe, low interest loans. And it was about cheating and robbing people and stripping wealth as they could. Now, this is where the truth of interconnectedness happens. Part of the formula of the racism is to test out on a community an evil product. And then once you've got it figured out, you move it on to the much wider mortgage market where there's much more money for the taking. And that's what ended up happening. But if we had been able to convince regulators and lenders themselves, who, all 5 of the major houses ended up either going under or being bought in a fire sale, right? This ultimately wasn't good for Wall Street either. If we'd been able to convince them to respect and to care about and to protect Black wealth, the one generation of Black wealth that had been allowed to grow in this country, then we would not have had the financial crisis of 2008.
I thought that was one of the most fascinating things about your talk. Really quite revealing.
So I wanted to transition into the specifics of the healing and peace portion of this work, and I guess the utility of the work and your scholarship and all of this as to what we can do now to like deal with our country's need to heal, right? That is something that I think we saw within the acceptance speech of President Biden inauguration, etc. We've seen it a lot in terms of the rhetoric, but it is something that I think many have underestimated, like using that term in many ways. It doesn't lay out the challenge, doesn't really speak to the challenge that doing such a thing on a massive scale, what that looks like. And so I guess, what would you recommend, or what would your thoughts be around tying this work to the work of healing that needs to take place in this country after everything that we've experienced over this past 4 years and well before?
Well, I'll start. And I was so touched that Heather talked about the truth, racial healing, and transformation work in her last chapter. We have to build a critical mass of public will to do this work. Some people think that the call for the healing is soft and fluffy and, from the heart. It's really a strategy. It recognizes that in a democracy, you need a majority. What was your term, Heather? Anti-racist, majoritarian?
Permanent.
Permanent. Exactly.
Multiracial, anti-racist majority.
I love it. But to get to that, you've got to bring people in. You've got to open people's minds and hearts. We know enough about neuroscience. We know enough about psychology and the power of story. We know enough about immersion experience. We know how to do this, how to build this critical mass, how to lead people into a transformational immersion experience that opens their eyes in ways. And we know how to sustain that. And so, the Community Relations Service in the Department of Justice was at one time a large effort to go in and mediate and conciliate and try to stop violence and stop, that was the first time and the only time in the history of this country that we actually put the federal government to work to try to bring peace, to make peace, right? I think, and of course, this last administration tried to zero that out, but it was created by Lyndon Johnson. But in my mind, if we were to take that and bring it to scale again, and also put resources into these communities in every state and every zip code around the country to do the work, to learn from the folks that have been doing it for the last 4 or 5 years or more, we could create a movement for real at scale that would be redefining this country, but most importantly, also building up the critical mass of public will to sustain the new future.
Yeah.
And that is the work. And it isn't going to happen by rhetoric alone. It's going to happen because we invest in it and we mobilize to make it happen.
That's right.
I love that ticker line going underneath, right? Permanent, majoritarian, low equality coalition.
Yeah.
T-shirt soon.
I love it.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just add one little coda onto what Dr. Christopher said. Oftentimes there are 2 bills in Congress to deal about a truth commission of some sort. One is HR 40, which is the study bill about reparations. And then the other is what has been HR 100, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
It's now 16, right?
And Senate 16, yes. Well, these bills change, but it's in the House. Representative Barbara Lee is the lead sponsor, and in the Senate, Senator Cory Booker, as well as many other senators, which would be to launch a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. And I see these things as really deeply connected because of the zero-sum lie. The conversation about reparations is viewed by the majority of white Americans as a zero-sum threat, right? Just as the relative pittance that was in the American Rescue Plan for Black farmers became the cause célèbre on Fox News. We moved nearly $2 trillion out to white, Black, brown, indigenous families. Nearly 90% of American families got a check. I mean, everybody got money, and yet they're able to try to drive down support for this huge bill by saying, look, it's going to benefit just Black people. That's the zero-sum lie, right? And so if we try to move reparations in that context without doing any of the organizing work, with the racial illiteracy that we have in this country, where only 8% of high school seniors know that the Civil War, a primary cause of the Civil War was slavery, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. 8%. How can we even begin to have a reparations conversation without doing the work? I mean, we can begin to have the conversation, obviously, but how can we do it in a way where it's not seen as a threat, where it doesn't create a backlash, where it doesn't undermine the cause of a permanent, multiracial, anti-racist, majoritarian coalition for equality, right? And so that's why I think what we have seen on the ground with the truth, racial healing, and transformation efforts that are in a couple of dozen places across the country, doing what they can with modest resources, is that they have moved hearts and minds, is that they have been basically grassroots organizing efforts to identify the real racial story, get on the same page so that we can begin to turn it, envision a future free of racism, and then connect the dots as to what needs to happen in those three areas, law, separation, and the economy, in those communities in order for us to move forward together. And so they have to be done in tandem.
I thank you for saying that. I totally agree. And to pick up on that Black farmers story, less than 0.1% of the money that was given during the Trump administration to farmers, less than 0.1% was given to African-American farmers. You see the absurdity of the narrative that is deliberately designed for division and is it deliberately unjust. The other point I'd like to make is, Heather uses the word we. And I often say, how do we create the we, right? The we that multiracial, permanent, majoritarian, anti-racist coalition. I probably got those out of order.
Sorry.
that is the new we, and so much of this work that is called for in our country right now is creating the we, getting to the we, to the us, the sum of us, that will stand for justice. And, it just doesn't happen because you say it's going to happen. It happens when you roll up your sleeves in every community and you do the work.
Wow. The people, that's what I keep thinking about. This movement that, Dr. Christopher and Heather are talking about and what needs to take place. It's going to happen when you have a movement of movements and people that are driving this, and local communities that are driving it. And it's really always been the case when we talk about needing and seeing structural change actually happen, right? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather for the last words as we close out, as we're rounding the hour. So Heather, go ahead and close us out with your last words, and I'll turn it over to my co-host Andy so we can give thanks.
Well, so much appreciation and gratitude to Busboys and Poets, to the Carter Center, to George Mason for making this happen this evening, to both of you for hosting. And, I dedicated the Sum of Us to my mother, because even though, as many children try, I tried to believe that you were totally wrong about everything in my teenage years. I tried to deny your wisdom. I tried to rebel against what you told me to do.
I love it.
I went far in my career to pick up a whole new area of expertise and involvement around the economy. I was not going to be, a soft, touchy-feely, race person. I was going to get the cold, hard numbers, and I was going to deal with the economy. And as often happens, I have returned to your wisdom So it's been a true joy to do this. I think we can break the news here that the next book that I'll write, that'll be the follow-up to The Sum of Us, is going to be a book that really looks at truth, racial healing, and transformation in more focus, looks at these solidarity dividends across the country, and it'll be co-written by the two of us. And it's a very special thing to get to feel like you are continuing the ancestral work of the line of people who made you possible. So I'm deeply grateful to my mother, as always. And thank you for reading The Sum of Us, everyone. Thank you for supporting the vision of a country where we are greater than the sum of its parts. Buy from your local independent bookstore, from the Busboys and Poets.
Yes.
I think the link will be in the YouTube chat, or you can just go to the website, I'm sure. Thank you all so much, and have a good and safe and healthy evening and weekend.
Great. Thank you all so much. Go ahead, Andy. Really.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to have both of you. Heather, thank you. Heather McGhee, thank you so much. And Dr. Gail Christopher, it's such a joy to have both of you. I've seen you, I know you from a distance, but now I feel like I'm so much closer. Thank you so much. And paradigm shifts take a long time. And we have in the past 10 years, or even less than that, the past couple of years, we have seen so many holes poked at this lie that we've been told about race and in America, that eventually this balloon that's been floating for so long is getting deflated slowly, surely. And thank you for adding one more hole in that balloon. Thank you so much for both of you.
Great.
Thank you both for hosting us. This has been an absolute joy. Thank you.
Great. And on behalf of the John Mitchell Jr. program and the Carter School, thank you all. We're closing out Peace Week in an amazing way, and we're just so honored. So be well and be safe, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Peace, love, and all good stuff, as we say. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.